The gentle rays of the rising sun painted the sky in shades of orange and pink as Staff Sergeant James Cooper pulled his old blue pickup truck into the empty parking lot of Dawn Lake. At 34, his face carried the marks of someone who had seen too much during his 3 tours in Afghanistan. The morning air was crisp, and a light mist danced across the lake's surface, reminding him of the peaceful mornings he spent here as a child with his late father. Cooper checked his watch. 5:30 a.m., perfect timing. He grabbed his tackle box and favorite fishing rod from the truck bed, both well-worn from years of use. His heavy boots crunched against the gravel as he made his way to his preferred spot, a quiet corner of the lake where the fish seemed most active during early hours. The soldier moved with natural alertness, a habit formed from years of military service. His muscular frame, hidden beneath a simple gray hoodie and cargo pants, showed his dedication to staying fit even after returning home. A scar near his right temple caught the morning light, a reminder of a close call during his last tour that had earned him a Purple Heart. As Cooper set up his gear, his mind wandered to the therapy sessions he'd been attending since returning home 3 months ago. His therapist had suggested finding peaceful activities to help ease his transition back to civilian life. Fishing, a skill his father taught him, seemed like the perfect choice. The repetitive motion of casting the line and the quiet anticipation of waiting for a bite helped quiet the memories that sometimes kept him awake at night. He baited his hook with practiced ease, using the live worms he bought from Old Joe's bait shop the evening before. The first cast landed perfectly, the line cutting through the morning mist with a satisfying whistle. Cooper settled into his folding chair, a thermos of black coffee within easy reach. The lake was his sanctuary, one of the few places where the constant tension in his shoulders began to ease. A family of ducks swam past, the mother leading her ducklings in a neat row. Cooper allowed himself a small smile, remembering how his father used to make up stories about the duck families they saw during their fishing trips. The memory was bittersweet. His father had passed away while Cooper was deployed, and he hadn't made it back for the funeral. Being here now felt like a way to honor those memories they'd shared. The first bite came just as the sun cleared the treeline. Cooper felt the familiar tug on his line and let his training take over. Patience was key in fishing, just as it had been in his military operations. He waited for the right moment, then began reeling in with steady, controlled movements. The fish, a decent-sized bass, fought against the line, but Cooper knew the dance well. Other early morning fishermen began arriving at the lake, nodding respectfully to Cooper as they passed. He was a familiar face here now, having made it his morning routine since returning home. Most knew he was a soldier. Small towns had a way of spreading such information, but they respected his desire for solitude. Old Bill, a Vietnam veteran who often fished nearby, gave his usual quiet salute before setting up his spot 30 yards down the shore. The morning passed peacefully as Cooper caught and released several fish. He kept his movements efficient and quiet, appreciating the simple rhythm of cast, wait, and reel. His military watch showed 7:15 a.m. when he heard the first distant rumble of motorcycles. The sound was faint but growing louder, disrupting the natural chorus of birdsong and lapping water that had surrounded him for the past 2 hours. Cooper's jaw tightened slightly. Dawn Lake was usually peaceful this early in the morning. He had chosen this spot specifically because it was known for its tranquility. As the rumbling grew louder, he noticed other fishermen looking up from their lines, their expressions showing similar concern. Something about the approaching noise felt different from the usual weekend riders who sometimes passed by. Something felt wrong. Little did he know, his peaceful morning was about to take a dramatic turn, and the skills he'd hoped to leave behind in Afghanistan would soon prove vital once again. The peaceful morning shattered as 5 motorcycles roared into Dawn Lake's parking area, their engines deliberately revving at full throttle. The bikes were massive black machines, covered in chrome and decorated with flame patterns. Empty beer cans rattled in the saddlebags, and heavy metal music blasted from one bike's speakers. The noise sent birds scattering from nearby trees and caused ripples across the lake's once calm surface. The bikers belonged to a group called the Road Demons, known troublemakers in 3 counties. Their leader, who went by the name Bear, stood an intimidating 6'4", his massive frame covered in tattoos and a leather vest displaying the gang's skull logo. His real name was Derek Thompson, but nobody had called him that in years. The other 4 bikers, Snake, Razor, Tiny, and Hawk, were smaller but looked just as mean, their faces showing the effects of too many bar fights and hard living. Cooper watched from his spot as the bikers dismounted, stumbling slightly. They were already drunk despite the early hour, passing a bottle of whiskey between them. Bear took a long drink and then threw the empty bottle into a nearby trash can, missing completely. The glass shattered on the ground, causing several other fishermen to look up in alarm. Well, boys. Bear's voice boomed across the lake. Looks like we found ourselves a nice little spot for a morning party. He laughed loudly, the sound echoing off the water. The other bikers joined in, their laughter harsh and threatening. Old Bill, the Vietnam veteran, quickly packed up his gear. He'd seen enough trouble in his life to know when to leave. Other fishermen followed his lead, gathering their equipment with nervous glances toward the bikers. Cooper remained seated, his face calm but his body alert. He'd dealt with bullies before, both in high school and in the military. These 5 were no different, just louder and drunk. The bikers spread out around their machines, pulling more beer and a portable radio from their bags. The music grew even louder as they set up what looked like an impromptu party. Razor, the youngest of the group, began throwing rocks into the lake, trying to hit the remaining fishing lines. "Hey, check out the soldier boy." Snake pointed at Cooper, noticing his military-style boots and alertness. "What's wrong, hero? Don't want to join our little party?" Bear turned his attention to Cooper, sizing him up with bloodshot eyes. He nudged Tiny, the shortest but whitest of the group. "Go invite our friend over. Looks like he could use some fun." Tiny grinned, revealing several missing teeth, and grabbed another beer. He walked toward Cooper, intentionally kicking up gravel with each step. The remaining fishermen took this as their final cue to leave, hurriedly packing their gear and heading for their cars. Cooper remained focused on his fishing line, though his senses tracked every movement around him. His years of combat training had taught him to stay aware without showing it. He could smell the cheap whiskey on Tiny's breath before the biker even reached him. "Hey, Mr. Soldier." Tiny's voice carried a mocking tone. "Boss wants to share a drink with you." He held out the warm beer, purposely holding it over Cooper's tackle box. When Cooper didn't respond, Tiny, accidentally, let the can slip from his fingers. Beer splashed across Cooper's carefully organized fishing lures and onto his boots. The other bikers roared with laughter from their spots near the parking lot. "Oops," Tiny grinned. "Guess you'll have to come get another one now." Cooper slowly placed his fishing rod in its holder, his movements deliberate and controlled. He wanted a peaceful morning of fishing, but sometimes peace had to be defended. As he stood up, his stance shifted subtly, feet shoulder-width apart, weight evenly distributed, hands relaxed but ready. It was a stance that would have been familiar to anyone who'd served in combat, but to the drunk bikers, he simply looked like an angry fisherman. They were about to learn a very important lesson about judging people by appearances. Cooper took a deep breath as he faced Tiny, keeping his voice steady and calm. His father had always taught him that a real man tries to avoid a fight first. "I'd appreciate it if you and your friends would keep the party away from the fishing areas," he said. "There's plenty of space by the picnic grounds." Tiny's face twisted into an ugly sneer. "Oh yeah? And what are you gonna do about it, soldier boy?" He took a step closer, trying to use his bulk to intimidate Cooper. The beer from the spill can dripped off Cooper's tackle box, creating small puddles in the dirt. Behind them, Bear and the others had stopped their laughing. They watched with interest, always eager to see Tiny push people around. Snake pulled out his phone, ready to record what he thought would be another funny video for their social media page. "Last weekend, we had a cop try to tell us what to do," Bear called out, walking toward them. His heavy boots crunched on the gravel. "He doesn't work in this county anymore." The threat in his voice was clear as day. Cooper remained still, his eyes tracking both Tiny and Bear. The other 3 bikers spread out, forming a loose circle. It was a familiar tactic: surround the target, make them feel trapped. But Cooper had faced worse situations in darker places. His heart rate stayed steady, his breathing controlled. "You got 2 choices here, boy," Bear said, now standing next to Tiny. "Either join our party and forget about your little fishing trip, or things get interesting." He cracked his knuckles for effect, the sound sharp in the morning air. The lake had gone quiet. Even the birds seemed to sense the tension in the air. The last remaining fisherman hurried to his car, but Cooper noticed him making a phone call as he drove away. Good. Local police would be notified. Now he just had to handle the situation until they arrived. There's always a third choice, Cooper replied, his voice carrying across the water. You could act like adults, respect public property, and let people enjoy their morning in peace. He kept his hands visible but ready, knowing what would likely come next. Razor, the youngest biker, laughed and threw an empty beer can toward Cooper. It missed, splashing into the lake. Look at this guy. Thinks he's some kind of hero. He pulled out another can and shook it up. Maybe he needs a shower to cool off. Cooper watched the can in Razor's hand, but his attention stayed on Bear and Tiny. They were the real threats. The others were just making noise. His Special Forces training had taught him to identify the primary dangers in any situation. You got some nerve talking to us about respect, Bear growled, taking another step forward. His breath reeked of whiskey and stale cigarettes. Do you know who we are? We're the Road Demons. We own these parts on weekends. I know exactly who you are, Cooper replied calmly. And I know you have a choice right now. The smart choice is to walk away. His words carried the weight of experience. Not a threat, but a fact. Bear's face turned red with anger. No one talked to him this way, especially not in front of his crew. He reached into his vest pocket, and Cooper noticed the glint of brass knuckles being slipped onto thick fingers. The morning sun now hung fully above the trees, casting long shadows across the lake shore. In the distance, a fish jumped, creating ripples that spread across the water's surface. The moment stretched out, like the calm before a storm. Last chance, soldier boy, Bear said, his voice dropping to a dangerous growl. Either you start showing some respect, or we're gonna teach you how we handle disrespect. Cooper didn't move, didn't flinch. His eyes, hard as steel, met Bear's bloodshot gaze. Years of combat experience had taught him that what happened next would depend on his response to this moment. Bear swung first, his brass knuckles cutting through the air where Cooper's head had been just a split second before. But Cooper wasn't there anymore. His combat training took over, muscle memory from countless hours of practice guiding his movements. The soldier stepped inside Bear's reach, using the bigger man's momentum against him. In one smooth motion, Cooper's elbow struck Bear's ribs, forcing the air from his lungs. The biker leader stumbled backward, shock replacing the confidence on his face. Nobody had ever moved that fast against him before. Get him, Bear wheezed, pointing at Cooper. Tiny and Snake rushed forward together, while Razor and Hawk spread out to cut off any escape routes. They had done this many times before, overwhelming their target with numbers, but they had never faced someone like Cooper. Tiny reached Cooper first, throwing a wild haymaker punch. Cooper deflected it with his forearm, then dropped low as Snake's kick whistled over his head. The two bikers ended up hitting nothing but air, nearly crashing into each other. Stay still, you little. Snake growled, pulling out a small chain from his back pocket. He swung it in wide arcs, trying to keep Cooper at a distance. The metal links whistled through the morning air. Cooper's face remained calm, his breathing steady. He moved like water, each step calculated and precise. The biker's angry shouts echoed across the lake, contrasting sharply with his silence. He didn't waste energy on words now. Action was needed. Hawk tried to grab Cooper from behind, but years of close quarters combat training kicked in. Cooper shifted his weight, using Hawk's own momentum to throw him forward. The biker crashed into Snake, sending them both sprawling onto the gravel. The chain clattered away, landing near Cooper's tackle box. Razor, seeing his friend struggling, pulled out a switchblade. The blade snapped open with a click that seemed loud in the morning air. Not so tough now, are you, soldier? He taunted, waving the knife back and forth. Cooper's eyes narrowed slightly. The situation had just become more dangerous. He could hear Bear getting back to his feet behind him, still wheezing but angry. Tiny was circling to his left, while Snake and Hawk were untangling themselves from their fall. Time seemed to slow down for Cooper, just like it had in combat. He noticed everything, the way Razor held the knife too loosely, how Tiny telegraphed his next punch by shifting his weight too early, the sound of Bear's heavy breathing getting closer. His mind calculated distances and angles, just as he'd been trained. Tiny charged again, trying to grab Cooper in a bear hug. Cooper stepped aside at the last second, using Tiny's momentum to send him crashing into Razor. The knife went flying, landing in the shallow water near the shore with a splash. Bear, having caught his breath, rushed at Cooper from behind. But Cooper had been tracking his movements by sound. He dropped to one knee, causing Bear to trip over him. The big biker leader went flying, landing face first in the mud near the water's edge. Snake and Hawk, now back on their feet, hesitated. They had never seen anyone handle their leader so easily. Cooper stood calmly between them, his stance relaxed but ready. His eyes moved between the 5 bikers, tracking each one's movement. "Last chance?" Cooper said quietly, his voice carrying across the now silent lakeshore. "Walk away. Nobody needs to get hurt anymore." His words weren't a threat. They were an offer of mercy. Something his commanders had taught him was just as important as fighting skill. Bear pushed himself up from the mud, his face now a mask of pure rage. Mud and water dripped from his beard and leather vest. "Nobody." He spat out dirt. "Nobody makes a fool of the road demons." He reached into his vest again, and this time Cooper saw something that made his expression harden. The glint of steel that could only be a gun. The moment Cooper saw the gun, everything changed. His face turned serious, and his whole body tensed like a coiled spring. 3 tours in Afghanistan had taught him exactly how dangerous this situation had become. This was no longer about a simple fight. It was about survival. "You really don't want to do that," Cooper said, his voice carrying a warning tone that made even Snake and Hawk take a step back. But Bear was too angry and drunk to notice the change in Cooper's demeanor. As Bear's hand moved to pull the gun from his vest, Cooper exploded into action. He covered the distance between them in 2 rapid steps, his movements precise and practiced. Before Bear could grip the weapon, Cooper's hand clamped down on his wrist with crushing force. The soldier's other hand struck Bear's elbow at exactly the right angle, using a technique he'd learned in Special Forces training. There was a sharp cry of pain as Cooper twisted Bear's arm behind his back. The gun fell from the biker's vest, but Cooper kicked it away before it hit the ground, sending it sliding under a nearby pickup truck. The move happened so fast that the other bikers barely had time to react. "Boss!" Tiny shouted, charging forward like an angry bull. But Cooper used Bear's large body as a shield, spinning the biker leader around to block Tiny's rush. The two crashed into each other, stumbling backward toward the water's edge. Snake and Hawk tried to attack from different sides, thinking they could overwhelm Cooper with numbers. But Cooper's combat training had prepared him for exactly this kind of situation. He moved like a shadow, always staying just out of reach, letting their wild swings tire them out. Razor, having recovered his knife from the shallow water, tried to sneak up behind Cooper, but the soldier's situational awareness, honed by years of combat, had never left him. Without even looking back, Cooper caught Razor's wrist as the young biker thrust the knife forward. In one smooth motion, he disarmed Razor and threw the knife far into the lake, where it sank with a quiet plop. "Stay down," Cooper commanded as he swept Razor's legs out from under him. The young biker hit the ground hard, the impact knocking the wind from his lungs. Snake tried to help his fallen friend, but received a precise strike to his solar plexus for his trouble. He doubled over, gasping for air. Hawk, seeing his friends falling one by one, pulled out a heavy chain similar to Snake's. He swung it in wide circles, trying to keep Cooper at a distance. But Cooper had dealt with far worse weapons in Afghanistan. He waited for the right moment, then stepped inside Hawk's guard. The chain whistled harmlessly overhead as Cooper delivered 2 quick strikes, one to Hawk's kidney, another to his knee. The biker dropped, clutching his leg in pain. Bear, having untangled himself from Tiny, roared in fury. He charged at Cooper again, this time pulling brass knuckles from his pocket, but his movements were sloppy, affected by both alcohol and rage. Cooper sidestepped the wild swing and used Bear's own momentum to throw him. The big biker leader went flying, landing hard on a wooden picnic table. The table collapsed under his weight with a loud crack. Tiny, the last biker still standing, looked around at his fallen friends. His confidence was gone, replaced by real fear. He had never seen anyone fight like this before. Cooper stood calmly in the middle of the chaos he had created, his breathing barely elevated. "Do you want to continue?" Cooper asked quietly, his eyes locked on Tiny's. "Or are we done here?" In the distance, police sirens began to wail. Someone, probably one of the fishermen who had left earlier, had called the authorities. The sound seemed to wake the bikers from their daze. They began to stir, groaning in pain. The police sirens grew louder as two patrol cars pulled into the lake's parking area, their lights flashing in the morning sun. Officer Sarah Martinez stepped out of the first car, her hand resting on her holster as she surveyed the scene. Behind her, Officer Mike Thompson emerged from the second car, his eyes widening at the sight before them. 5 bikers lay scattered around the lakeside area, some groaning, others trying to stand up on shaky legs. In the middle of it all stood Cooper, still calm and collected. The broken picnic table, scattered beer cans, and general chaos told a story of serious trouble. "Hands where I can see them. Everyone," Officer Martinez commanded, her voice firm and professional. Cooper immediately raised his hands, showing his palms to the officers. He knew the drill: compliance first, explanations later. There, still lying in the wreckage of the picnic table, tried to push himself up. "Officer," he slurred, pointing at Cooper, "that man attacked us. We were just having a peaceful morning when he went crazy." The other bikers, following their leader's lead, began shouting similar accusations. "There's a gun," Cooper said calmly, not moving from his spot. Under the blue pickup truck, the leader pulled it during the fight. His voice carried the steady tone of someone used to giving situation reports. Officer Thompson carefully approached the truck, flashlight in hand. He knelt down and looked underneath. "Found it," he called out, carefully retrieving the weapon with a gloved hand. "It's loaded, Sarah." The situation changed immediately. Officer Martinez drew her weapon, ordering everyone to lie face down on the ground. The bikers, seeing the serious turn of events, finally stopped their shouting and complied. "Sir," Martinez addressed Cooper, who was already kneeling with his hands behind his head, "I need your ID and an explanation of what happened here." "Staff Sergeant James Cooper, ma'am. Recently returned from my 3rd tour in Afghanistan," he spoke clearly and respectfully. "My military ID is in my front right pocket, along with my concealed carry permit, though I'm not armed today." As Officer Thompson began handcuffing the bikers, starting with Bear, a familiar truck pulled into the parking lot. It was Old Bill, the Vietnam veteran who had left earlier. He wasn't alone. 3 other fishermen had returned with him. "Officers," Old Bill called out, walking forward slowly with his hands visible, "we saw everything that happened. Been watching from up there." He pointed to the overlook area above the lake. "That soldier was just fishing when these troublemakers showed up and started causing problems. He tried to talk them down peaceful-like, but they wouldn't have it." The other fishermen nodded in agreement, each one stepping forward to give their account. They described how Cooper had repeatedly tried to de-escalate the situation, how the bikers had been drinking and harassing people, and finally, how Bear had pulled the gun. Officer Martinez listened carefully to each witness while her partner finished securing the bikers. She looked at the road demons' leather vests and frowned. "Aren't you the same group that caused trouble at Pine Creek last weekend?" Bear's face went pale. The incident at Pine Creek had involved property damage and assault. They were already under investigation for that. Now, with witnesses, assault charges, and a loaded weapon involved, things were looking much worse for the road demons. "Staff Sergeant." Officer Martinez turned back to Cooper, her tone softening slightly. "You can stand up now. We'll need a full statement from you, but it looks like you handled this situation about as well as anyone could." Cooper rose slowly, his hands still raised until Martinez nodded that it was okay to lower them. He looked at the bikers being led to the patrol cars, no anger or satisfaction in his expression, just the calm focus of someone who had done what needed to be done. Old Bill walked over and picked up Cooper's fallen fishing rod, dusting it off carefully. "Think maybe we can get back to fishing now, son?" he asked with a slight smile. "Water's still good for another few hours." The next hour at Dawn Lake was filled with activity as more police cars arrived. Detective Mark Wilson from the county sheriff's office showed up, particularly interested in the road demons case. He stood with officers Martinez and Thompson, taking notes as they discussed the situation. Cooper sat on his fishing chair, giving his official statement to another officer. He described everything in clear, precise detail: the bikers' arrival, their harassment, his attempts to de-escalate, and finally, the fight itself. The officer seemed impressed by how organized and professional his account was. "You said you tried to walk away 3 times?" the officer asked, looking up from his notepad. "Yes, sir," Cooper replied. Military training emphasizes avoiding conflict when possible. Force is always the last resort. He pointed to the scattered beer cans and broken picnic table. I only acted when Bear pulled the gun. At that point, the situation became life-threatening. Nearby, forensics officers were photographing the scene and collecting evidence. They paid special attention to the gun they'd found under the truck. One officer carefully bagged the brass knuckles and the remaining chains as evidence. Old Bill and the other fishermen had finished giving their statements and now stood near their usual fishing spots, talking quietly among themselves. They kept glancing at Cooper with a mixture of respect and gratitude. Word was already spreading around the lake about how one soldier had stood up to the infamous road demons. Detective Wilson walked over to Cooper, holding a thick file in his hands. "Staff Sergeant," he said, "I want to thank you. We've been building a case against the road demons for months. They've been terrorizing small towns across 3 counties, but people were too scared to testify." He patted the file. "With today's witnesses and evidence, plus the gun charge, we can finally shut them down." Cooper nodded simply. "Just did what needed to be done, sir." He looked at his tackle box, still damp from the spilled beer. "Though I'd rather have spent the morning catching fish." Officer Martinez approached with Cooper's ID and some paperwork. "The DA's office will probably contact you next week," she explained. "But don't worry, this is clearly self-defense, with multiple witnesses. You handled it by the book." She smiled slightly, "Though I doubt they'll be teaching your exact techniques at the police academy." As the police cars began to leave, taking the road demons to the county jail, other vehicles started pulling into the parking lot. Word had gotten around, and local news reporters were showing up, eager to cover the story of how one soldier had taken down a notorious biker gang. Cooper shook his head at the approaching reporters. "Think I've had enough excitement for one day," he said to Old Bill, who was still standing nearby. "Know any quieter fishing spots?" The old veteran grinned and pointed to his truck. "Follow me, son. I know a perfect place just up the river. No bikes allowed, have to hike in." He gathered his gear and started walking to his vehicle. "Though I gotta warn you, the fish there are harder to catch than drunk bikers." Cooper packed up his equipment, carefully wiping the beer off his tackle box. As he worked, a young boy who had arrived with his father approached him cautiously. "Sir?" the boy asked, eyes wide with excitement. "My dad says you're a real hero, like the ones in movies." Cooper knelt down to the boy's level, his face serious but kind. "No movies here, young man. Just remember, a real hero tries to avoid fights first. Use your head and your words before anything else." He smiled slightly. "And always bring a good fishing rod." The boy nodded enthusiastically, clutching his own small fishing pole. His father stood nearby, nodding in approval at Cooper's words. Loading his gear into his truck, Cooper looked back at Dawn Lake one last time. The morning sun now sat high in the sky, its light sparkling off the calm water. Despite everything that had happened, it was still a beautiful day for fishing. 3 months after the incident at Dawn Lake, life had returned to its peaceful rhythm. The early morning fog rolled across the water just like it always had, but things were different now. A new sign stood at the parking lot entrance. "Dawn Lake, family-friendly fishing area, no alcohol allowed." Below it, someone had added a smaller sign that read "Protected by local heroes." Cooper sat in his usual spot, casting his line into the calm water. His tackle box, now replaced with a newer model, a gift from the local fishing club, sat beside him. Old Bill was in his regular place 30 yards down the shore, and several other fishermen dotted the lakeside. The story of what happened that morning had spread far beyond the county lines. The local newspaper had run a front-page story titled "Soldier Protects Community. Road Demons Gang Finally Brought to Justice." Cooper had politely declined all interview requests, preferring to let his actions speak for themselves. Detective Wilson had kept Cooper updated on the case. Bear and his gang were facing serious charges, not just from the lake incident, but from their previous crimes as well. The loaded gun had belonged to Bear, and it turned out to be stolen. That alone carried a hefty sentence. Many people from other towns had come forward after hearing about Cooper's stand, sharing their own stories about the road demons bullying. The lake had become more popular with families since the incident. Parents felt safer knowing that the bikers were gone, and the regular fishermen had become an informal neighborhood watch. Cooper often noticed people pointing him out to their children, telling them in hushed voices about the soldier who protected the lake. Today was special, though. Cooper checked his watch, 7:30 a.m. Right on time, he heard footsteps approaching behind him. It was Mike, the young boy who had talked to him after the incident, arriving for his weekly fishing lesson. "Morning, Mr. Cooper," Mike called out, carrying his fishing rod carefully just like Cooper had taught him. His father walked behind him, carrying a thermos of coffee to share. Cooper smiled, remembering how this tradition had started. After the incident, Mike's father had asked if Cooper would teach his son about fishing. "A good fisherman," the father had said, "needs patience, respect for nature, and good judgment, all things my son could learn from someone like you." "Ready for today's lesson?" Cooper asked, making space for Mike to set up his gear. "The bass are biting early this morning." As Mike excitedly prepared his line, Cooper noticed a familiar face walking down the path, Officer Martinez. She had started stopping by occasionally during her morning patrols, usually bringing fresh coffee and updates about the community. "Thought I'd find you here," she said, smiling. "Just got word from the DA's office. Bear and his gang took a plea deal yesterday. They'll be away for a long time, and they've agreed to stay out of the county after they're released." Cooper nodded, helping Mike adjust his fishing line. The news brought a sense of closure, though he hadn't been worried about the road demons returning. Sometimes, one firm stand was all it took to change things for the better. The morning sun climbed higher, warming the cool air. More families began arriving at the lake, setting up their fishing spots or preparing picnic breakfasts. Kids rode their bikes along the shoreline path, their parents watching without the worry that had been common just a few months ago. Old Bill walked over, carrying his usual morning newspaper. "Fish aren't biting at my spot," he said, settling down near Cooper's group. "Mind if I join you all?" He turned to Mike with a wink. "Besides, I hear this young man's becoming quite the fisherman." Cooper looked around at the peaceful scene. Families enjoying their morning, kids playing safely, fishermen sharing stories. This was why he had served, why he had trained so hard. Not for the big moments of conflict, but for the quiet moments of peace that came after. A fish tugged at Mike's line, making the boy gasp with excitement. "Remember what I taught you," Cooper said quietly, watching his student put the lessons into practice. Patience and control, just like everything else in life. The morning stretched ahead, full of promise, as the lake continued its timeless rhythm under the brightening sky.